يا راغبا في كل علم نافع.
ينمو العلم ويتقدم بتقنياته ومجالاته، ومعه نطور أدواتنا في تقديم العلم الشرعي. أكاديمية
زاد أكاديمية ينبوعها صاف ليروي غلة الظمآن. هذه عقيدتنا الصحيحة فطرة تنفي الشكوك بواضح البرهان. بشرى لنا زاد أكاديمية للعلم كالأزهار في البستان.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. More of the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the belief in the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in His names and attributes in this Islamic creed level 2. And these attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He is a successful person, the one that knows them and believe in them in the right way, without resemblance, without denying, without altering the meanings of it, and then worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala according to them. One of these attributes that the people of Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guided them to be firm upon the belief of the companions radiallahu anhum, is the attribute of ad-dahik. And ad-dahik means, from the human perspective, because nothing is the like of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is translated as laughing or smiling. This is what ad-dahik means. And to attribute this to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we have to make sure that this is in the wahi, in the revelation from Allah, in the Quran, in the authentic sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. And once it's established that it's there, then we apply the rules that we get to know from the Quran and the sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, that this is a beautiful attribute of Allah. We know the meaning of it, but we do not alter the meaning of it. We do not make any resemblance or similarities to the human beings or to the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Nothing is the like of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not the like of al-dahik or laughing of the human beings. So where do we get this attribute from? The hadith in Bukhari and Muslim and others, where the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, he said, يَضْحَكُ اللَّهُ إِلَى رَجُلَيْن. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala yadhak. So this is the attribute which translated as laughs or smiles to two men. يَقْتُلُ أَحَدُهُمَا الْآخَرِ. And the reason why I say laugh or smile, this is in English, but in Arabic is yadhak. And this is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best how. We don't talk about how, we're just translating it. But how we know the meaning of it is clear. But how that happens, it is not the like of the ways of the human beings. So you have to be extremely careful and to just believe in what's mentioned without going further by saying other things, because nothing is the like of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that attribute of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to two men, يَقْتُلُ أَحَدُهُمَا الْآخَرِ. One would kill the other. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala يضحك, laughs to two of these people. One kills the other. So both of them, they will enter Jannah. How is that? يُقَاتِلُ هَذَا فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ. One of them was fighting for the sake of Allah. فَيُقْتَلْ. So he was killed. So he becomes a martyr. Then the killer, ثُمَّ يَتُوبُ اللَّهُ عَلَى الْقَاتِلِ. Then the killer repents to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He becomes a Muslim, he repents to Allah, and then فَيُسْتَشْهَدْ. Then he becomes martyred also. So both of them, they enter the Jannah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Amazing mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we have to also be careful not to describe the meaning of it with the effect of it. If a person says that means Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most merciful, yeah, you can say that. That means this is the effect of this attribute, without altering the meaning of the attribute. Don't say that it means rewards, it means mercy. No, ad-dahik is ad-dahik, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala stated it. And the effect of it, this is something else. And that's why if a person knows that, then he hope for the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most merciful. So this is ad-dahik, or laughing, is one of the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Nothing is the like of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not like the ways of the human beings. One last one, inshallah ta'ala, towards the end of this beautiful course, is the attribute of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is al-jamil, or the most beautiful. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most beautiful, subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when it comes to the beauty of the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when it comes to the actions of Allah, every action from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is upon that beauty. It's the most beautiful thing. Even what people think when they look into this universe that we live in, and there are killing and bloodshed and miseries and so on, when it comes to the actions of Allah, it's the most beautiful. And evil is not to be attributed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, meaning in the absolute sense. Because whatever evil is created, it's there for a reason. And the reason is to extract from the believers the acts of ubudiyyah and servitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that can never be shown unless there are evil. So if there's no evil, how would people establish the jihad fi sabilillah? If there was no evil, how would people establish the patience to be patient and worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, faces difficulties and fear no one but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even if they are threatened or killed or so. So beautiful acts of worship comes as a result of these evil things that happens on the face of earth. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-Jameel. He's the most beautiful subhanahu wa ta'ala in His being, in His actions, in everything that is attributed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam mentioned this attribute by saying, Inna Allah jamilun yuhibbul jamal. Al-kibru batarul haqq wa ghamtun nas. When someone asks the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, is it from al-kibr? Is it from the arrogance that a person wears nice clothing and have nice shoes and things like this? The Prophet ﷺ, he said, Inna Allah jamilun yuhibbul jamal. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most beautiful and He loves beauty. There's nothing wrong, haram, in for you to look nice. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most beautiful and He loves beauty according to what's halal and not according to what Allah forbade. And then He denied that for a person to wear something nice is not necessarily arrogance. Then the Prophet ﷺ defined arrogance by saying al-kibr, or arrogance, is batarul haqq wa ghamtun nas, is to reject the truth and to belittle the people or look down upon the people. So it states the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala al-Jameel, and as a result of that, what brings into the hearts of the believers this perfect love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You know, human beings, when they love something in this life, they love what is beautiful, right? And how or who is the one that created that in themselves? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the creator of everything that is beautiful is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So who's the one that deserve to attain or to have this attribute in the perfect way? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So He's the most beautiful subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that brings the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the hearts. There's no like of it. And that's why this love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the hearts makes the person obedient to Allah with love, to the acts of obedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with the fear of Allah, with hoping for the rewards from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And also a person would beautify his speech, his actions, his manners, because beauty is not just something physical. You know, what we say either can be a beautiful thing or an ugly thing. Whenever we act, either our actions are beautiful actions or ugly actions, evil actions. And this is how we should see things. The same thing with manners. If a person look at the mirror when he's extremely angry and acting foolishness, this is not a beautiful thing, but rather the manners, the goodness of the person, and all of that as a result of believing in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that He's the most beautiful subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is a good ending for the course and the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to live our life with this beauty of the deen of Islam, to enjoy learning the knowledge of the religion of Islam. It's the most beautiful thing. It's the most valuable thing for a person to learn the most beautiful things, to get to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is the most beautiful thing, and to be steadfast upon the deen of Allah, which is the most beautiful thing. We need to re-evaluate the way that we perceive things. People might see things and they say this is so beautiful, but in reality, if the reality of it is shown, it's the ugliest thing. You know, versus something that people might say this is ugly, but in reality it's the most beautiful thing. When you see people, for example, in the state of al-ihram, making hajj, they don't look beautiful. They're sweaty, they're uncombed, they're dusty, they're wearing rags basically, and things like this. But to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is the most beautiful thing, because they are fulfilling the servitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When someone is fasting, and as a result of fasting, the smell of one's mouth will change, which is a normal thing when person is not having anything in their stomach. But to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is more beloved than the smell of musk. So it's a beautiful thing. But just this is a sign to understand that it's not just about the beautiful thing that sinful people would see, or the disbelievers will see, those who are deceived in this life, but to redefine things according to the end of it, according to what is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is one of the great benefits of knowledge. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us among those who have sound belief and those who have the proper effect in their hearts and in their speech and actions with the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
يا راغبا في كل علم نافع
ينمو العلم ويتقدم بتقنياته ومجالاته، ومعه نطور أدواتنا في تقديم العلم الشرعي. أكاديمية
زاد أكاديمية ينبوعها صاف ليروي غلة الظمآن. هذه عقيدتنا الصحيحة فطرة تنفي الشكوك بواضح البرهان. بشرى لنا زاد أكاديمية للعلم كالأزهار في البستان.